semnol kake mo faseda.
And we're live.
Welcome to Talking in Stations, a podcast about EVE Online. I am Matterall, and I'm here with Ashterothi.
Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashterothi, and it has been a hell of a year and a brand new one.
And also Elise is here.
Hey, how's it going?
Awesome. All right, let's talk some EVE Online. This is going to be the second part of the Decade in Review. If you didn't catch the first part, you can catch it on YouTube at TIS Station. You can find that at talkinginstations.com. So that was a 2-hour special. We talked about the first 5 years of the decade. We tried to do the whole decade. Didn't work. So we got to 2015, right about when Phoebe changes hit and the aftermath of that. And we kind of settled all the business of the first 5 years, which was very interesting. And today we're going to continue that and start with 2015, right about the Brave coup era, and move forward all the way up until today, with an emphasis on the stuff that happened, I guess, up until 2018. Okay, Elise and Ash, thanks for joining me, guys.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is an era of EVE that I remember very fondly. It was a very fun set of times, which started with, as you mentioned, like when the Phoebe jump changes happened. The meta of EVE Online shifted quite substantially, right? So before Phoebe, and we talked about this beforehand, but I'll just quickly review. Before Phoebe, if you want to defend your space, the best strategy was to have a lot of fallow space to make your enemy grind through to get to you. And then also that created like, hey, I can use this fallow space to have renters. And then it's even better. So people are paying me to be my buffer. When Phoebe jump changes happened, the idea of having a lot of a space that you don't really care too much about, it became really hard to deal with, right? So the first incarnation of Phoebe with the jump changes was really, really grim. It was very hard to move anywhere outside of a single region. So groups started to, diminish their holdings. The Imperium diminished their holdings. Pandemic Legion even sold off all of their renter space and made their footprint a lot smaller. And they ended up rotating down south to Providence, where these kind of fun newbies were still hanging around in Ketch and having a little skirmish with CVA over some areas in Providence. And the newbies the new players we're talking about, of course, are Brave Newbies. And part of the reason why Brave Newbies are important, actually, Brave Newbies are like substantially important to the second half of the decade. I think they're probably the most important group from 2015 onward. And part of the reason that they had a lot of success is because CCP made a few changes to how frigates worked. Basically, they rebalanced frigates and cruisers and made frigates not super sucky. Before this, you had maybe a handful of frigates that were good. But now after this, you had everyone that could fly a frigate could do some crucial roles. So it wasn't just suicide tackle. They could do E-War, they could do some damage, they can kite around, they can make bookmarks for you, make on-grid pings. It was just really fantastic what the frigates could do.
Right. Now, this is a good time to point out that you did a fantastic presentation at EVE Vegas this year, 2019. What was that called so people can find it?
What name did I settle on? It was A History of EVE. And I should know the name of it.
Put you on the spot, sorry.
But it's essentially a history of EVE Online throughout the years and what ships you would be flying depending on what year you were flying or you were playing in EVE Online and what you could expect to see.
Yeah, that was one of the best presentations I have ever seen, ever.
I think I settled on A History of EVE's most popular ships and doctrines. I think that was the name.
Yeah. And I think that was what I tried to do. And I, in a weird way, although my my presentation at Vegas was very popular. It was even more popular than the keynote on 2017 called The Continuum of War, where I talk about the last 5 years of war, which we'll review a lot about today. But what I was trying to do was what you did, which was show how the mutations of the gameplay were affecting politics and how the flavors of ships that people preferred were changing and how that affected war. I wouldn't say that's what I was trying to do, but that was a component that I was trying to get in there. And so anyway, that's a must-see presentation from Vegas 2019. Look up Elise Randolph.
Well,
okay, so sure. So, and you were saying Brave Newbies forums, and their whole thing was, I think what happened is that Asakai brought in a lot of players for the Battle of Asakai, brought in a lot of players from Reddit, because that battle was listed in Reddit in the video games forum. So a lot of players that don't play Eve saw that it was a big fight and said, I want to be a part of that. They get into the game and they go in right through Reddit to Test Alliance, which is Reddit. But Reddit had what I would call a series of leaders that were incapable of the growth rate that they were having, and their culture was also really, really inconsistent and spastic, and they just trashed the local all the time. And so a lot of people were like, well, I want to play, but I don't want to play with these guys. And I think Brave was kind of an alternative to Test after Test lost a ton of power after the Fountain War.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect description for kind of why Brave was good, right? And after Asakai, like that's a crucial moment when people start subbing to the game saying, oh, this is a cool sci-fi game where lots of stuff explodes. I want in. And those type of people got into it. And as you mentioned, Test was kind of, this was at one of their lower points. A lot of internally, like they had a lot of schisms. People went to other groups. And I think their mentality was, we want to, keep it low key for a little while because we got really big. And, it's just, they kind of got burned on that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative to Test part is really important. Reddit, so Test had basically taken ownership of Reddit. It came from Reddit. Test Alliance Please Ignore is a reference to Reddit, and the fact that one of Reddit's earliest, most popular posts that became the biggest meme was Test Post Please Ignore, which is where Test Alliance Please Ignore comes from. But as all these people were coming into after Asakai, there was one guy who was this business dude. So he's like really good at managing people. And he comes in and he sees this attitude of people that was in the game at the time, which was basically, ISK per hour, totally like, who cares about fun? It's all about like efficiency and rah, and, the way that we sometimes get as Eve players. And so he really enjoyed what Eve represented as a newer player, but he didn't really appreciate the way that organizations treated Eve Online. And so that's why he originally he's like, well, I know how to manage people. So he started this idea of Brave Newbies, which was this celebration of non-bitterness, right? This fun per hour, this counterculture against what you would see as kind of the traditional Eve structure. And it really took off because people were looking for an alternative for Test.
Yeah. So there's Brave Newbies. They have, again, their own growth problems where they just grow too fast. They're explosive growth with people coming into the game.
They actually had to change the rules. They had to add more, they had to increase the number of players in a corporation per rank in the skill because Brave Newbies filled up.
Right. I think more than once. And what happens is that they essentially start having growth pains because as players become more efficient or better at the game, they actually want to improve. And the whole thing for Brave Newbies was to constantly keep it at the new player level so that everybody could participate. And those two things start to wear on each other. There's some leadership issues, and you have a fracture of, you have groups like Elise's Pandemic Legion and Goonswarm looking at these groups saying, hey, these guys are useful, right? Because of E-War. Let's see if we can win them over to our side. Was it something like that, Elise?
Yeah, pretty much. So it was actually kind of like the perfect storm that happened. That made Brave seem to be like this jewel. So the last like big campaign that Pandemic Legion had, and we had a lot of allies, including Tess and stuff. It was to remove AAA as like the force in the South. So AAA like habitually just usually goes to LoSec or Stain, and they rebuild and wait for the invaders to leave and come back. But the Money Badger Coalition or the Honey Badgers Coalition, sorry, was so relentless in their occupation of the area that AAA, they started hemorrhaging members. Key corporations left, key FCs left, and they were gone. They were not coming back in the same way ever again. And that left this massive void in the South. And so Brave Collective moved from LoSec over to Catch in the South. And all these groups were kind of courting them a little bit. So they weren't necessarily getting invaded. So Nully Secunda and NC Dot bankrolled Brave Collective for a while. I think Goons had kind of like a hey, let's not roll over these guys just yet type of agreement going on.
Yeah,
just to watch to see what would happen.
They sent diplomats to try to help them out to set up their services and stuff like that.
Yeah, so Brave, found themselves in this great area of nullsec, being courted by everybody and with members rushing towards them, which is, it sounds great, but it's like too much success all at once. And I think it became a little bit overwhelming to a lot of people.
For scale, they grew up to about 10,000 players. And that's a corporation, basically. It was one corporation with a few satellite corporations for wormholes and little things here and there, but basically one corporation of 10,000 players.
So yeah, they got quite big. And then Pandemic Legion, so basically Brave Collective were like, okay, we're gonna, flaunt our newfound success, and we're going to launch a campaign against CVA. CVA has been like a middling alliance since the server turned on, and I don't think they've changed one iota at all since then. So they're a good person to fight if you're a newer group, especially if you need experience. CVA had quite a bit at the time. Their lead FC was named Core Blood Brothers, probably one of the most underrated FCs in EVE Online's history.
I used to interview him a lot. Yeah, he's a nice guy.
Super great, super relentless. His story is quite fun to follow. But so Brave and CVA are fighting, and then PL kind of have no idea what to do. So we go into third party third party of the fights, and Brave and CVA, obviously, because this is what happens. They just stop fighting. They're like, you know what, screw this. We're not going to make content for you just so you can feed off of us, which is the right course of action, right? That's what you're supposed to do. It's just frustrating when you're part of that. And so then PL starts shooting Brave a little bit without having any, big. They don't want the space. They don't want to kill Brave. They just want to shoot people that are fun to shoot and kind of change some of their doctrines, because there have been quite a lot of doctrine changes going on or ship changes going on in EVE Online, and especially with Phoebe, we wanted to see how that would affect how we played the game.
Yeah.
So we do that. We fight them for a while and eventually leave, and then CVA or Brave, goes really happy. We're like, we're doing great. We managed to fend off PL and all that. And they went back to CVA, took some space, and then called it quits. So like, okay, we only want this part of Providence. And we're not going to go any further. It's the part that's right on Catch anyways. So they come to some sort of agreement. They do like skirmishes and have quite a lot of fun like that way, but there's no meaningful content after. And then PL come back after their a few months later after their contract with to help XIX is over, and they start pounding them again. And this time it kind of feels a little bit different. because PL has now refined their tactics a little bit more as they're refining more and more and more. Brave Collective and the Brave Newbies, they actually get quite good at their doctrine, but they start to have internal fractures going on. People have different ideas. The bulk of Brave Newbies, I'd say 99.9% of the 10,000 members were like, hey, we just want to have fun. We don't give a crap. Like, we'll just do whatever the most fun per hour is for us. If that's jamming Elise Randolph so he cries on Reddit, then we'll do that. And they definitely did that. They would just have like 100-man E-War fleets augmenting their already massive fleets just to jam like FCs and target callers. And it was super effective.
Yeah.
They really held their own. But, some fractures started to form in Brave Collective. People started saying, hey, I can do this, but better. A few key people left. And I'm not sure if I get the timing right on this, but I know Porkbutt leaves and forms Karma Fleet.
Yeah, he's lured out by Scion to form up. Because Porkbutt was somebody who wanted to do the spy game, and leadership in Brave, Licton, didn't want to do that because they wanted to stay clear of politics. They wanted to just get into the actual gameplay that's fun, not the subversive empire building and espionage subterfuge part of the game. And so Porkbutt said, okay, well, I'll just go do that for Goonswarm.
So like a few events happen. FCs kind of go out of what their leaders told them to do, but the FCs are like, whatever, I'm having fun, like who cares? They go into some others. And by now, and I probably should have mentioned this before, it's not just Brave. They have a coalition called the Hero Coalition, which includes Test and a bunch of other like smaller new player oriented groups.
So it's very funny because modern day now Legacy is basically Test plus Brave, but back then it was the other way around. It was Brave plus Test.
Yeah, Test were like this super small group, and eventually, like during the fighting, they're like, "Hey, Brave, we love you guys, but we're leaving. Like, we can't take this anymore. We're a small group, anyways. Let's get the heck out of here." And they go off to Wicked Creek. But yeah, Brave Collective fracture in just hilarious ways to the outside view. People inside Brave probably bemoan this a little bit, but it was really, really funny on the outside to see it all break down, because like members of Brave just didn't trust other members of Brave, but their leader had come up with like an agreement to keep PL from taking all their space. Essentially, a guy called Lenny, who was a member of I Want Disc, had so much ISK and in-game assets, he had no idea what to do with it. So he's like, I love these Brave guys. I'm going to pay Pandemic Legion off to make sure they don't take any space. And we accepted that contract. We're like, okay, this is great.
He paid the wrong guy first.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So yeah, they paid the wrong guy first, but we fixed that.
Oh yeah.
So we're like, okay, this is great. But here are a few of our terms. And one of the terms are like, you guys can't just say, oh, we're paying PL, so we're not going to fight. Well, obviously we understand that things happen, and you also can't there were just a bunch of terms. And they were kind of secret terms. PL line members didn't really know it. They suspected something every time a final timer happened, and we just didn't show up to it. After that happened a few times, they started to suspect it. But because there was so much distrust going on within Brave, the leaders didn't kind of announce this deal at all. It just kind of was a happy accident all the time. And then there was a coup. And Matterall, you can probably talk to the coup a little bit more, but from my point of view, the funniest part of the coup within Brave is it happened because there was a lack of trust between the groups. So, and that lack of trust ended up like voiding the Pandemic Legion contract and everything.
Right. This is a very interesting story. And actually, you can read it in an article I wrote back at the time called The Brave Story. Oh, I'm forgetting my article names too. And it tells you the whole timeline of what's going on here. And there's a lot of interesting pieces. And it's almost like a tragic comedy where it's like Romeo and Juliet, where the message doesn't get through that it's a fake suicide. So Romeo kills himself, and then she wakes up, and then she kills herself. It's that kind of a thing where things were not being understood because they couldn't be talked about publicly. But essentially what happens is there is a breaking off of these new players, and you have Karma Fleet, which is now one of the biggest corporation in Goonswarm, and you have Horde break off for Pandemic Legion, which is one of the biggest players in the NCPL area. And Brave is essentially becomes the third leg in that group of four new player corporations that are massive in scale.
Yeah. So when you're talking about, so initially, as we mentioned before, all these groups tried to court Brave, and Brave, they wanted to be their own group. They wanted to be independent. They didn't want to be beholden to anyone else. So, like, I know from PL's perspective, we offered them something like 2 trillion ISK to go in, which is our entire fee for a contract, if they would just go with us. Like, we just wanted to build a better relationship with them. And they were like, "No, this is a trick. You're trying to trick us," just because they just didn't.
Did you like every time you try to give advice, people would say like, "He's just meta playing us."
Yeah. So I loved the whole Brave Newbies thing. I loved Brave Newbies at the start when I first found them in LoSec. I like stumbled upon them. I was trying to like do some pirating in LoSec. There's this guy in a Megathron and like a little guy in an Atron. And the guy in an Atron shot the Megathron, so the Megathron shot back, and then 100 Atrons undocked right out of it and killed the Megathron. And I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen in my life. I need these people to survive. So I'd go on the Brave subreddit and try and help them out like constantly. And they were like, "Oh, this guy he's like some snake. He's just giving us advice that's bad to make us die." So I'd go ahead and do the exact opposite of everything I suggested.
Well, it tells you about how people just were told, don't trust anybody, however good they seem or whatever. But we have to move on from Brave because we could do the whole show on this. Ash, I wanted to bring you in, though, about Hydrostatic Podcast, I think, was going at this time, wasn't it? This was your podcast.
Yeah, it was about then. It was the 2014, 2015 era, I believe, was when we were kind of at our height of Hydrostatic.
Probably the best podcast that has ever been created. If you're a fan of talking in stations, it's worth going back to listen to Hydrostatic Podcast, even now, to listen to how polished that show was. Well,
I do appreciate it, but I will point out that Fyridian did an amazing job as an editor, and he... So basically, it started where I was doing Hydrag podcast with Random McNally and Kyle Yanowski, and I wanted to do a more kind of structured, like blocked out sort of podcast. So I went to Fyridian Lockbox and kind of pitched the idea, and Fyridian really liked it, but he insisted on the fact that it had to be polished, it had to be good, and so he put a lot of work into it. And so there's two pieces to it. First of all, we wanted to have this idea of like finding the expert. If we wanted to talk about something, we wanted to find somebody who really knew about that thing in order to talk to them about it. Because one of the things that bothered me was people who were on podcasts and would talk and just get things wrong all the time. And it's like putting out bad information. So it's like, I wanted people that would be able to give good information. And I think that, by the way, Talking in Stations has definitely surpassed us as our spiritual successor in that. But also, one of the weird things about it was, as kind of an aside, Fyridian said, "Well, I'm trying to get into the lore. Would it be possible for me to have a lore segment?" And I was like, "Sure, that sounds great." Like, none of us really knew very much about it. It was still kind of that weird thing that like this small handful of people know about and nobody else does anything with. And so episode by episode, Fyridian would take one of the chronicles or a couple of the chronicles and would like take a whole bunch of notes and then basically explain to me what is going on in these things. And by far, I think that is probably the thing that made us most successful. Even though it was less than a third of our podcast any given day, we got known as the Lore Podcast. And actually, if you go to hydrostaticeve.com right now, we've split out all of the old Know Your Lore segments and put them individually, so you don't have to listen to the rest of the podcast. And so I like to say that if you listen to that, you'll actually hear me learn about the lore in real time.
Which broke off into these lore panels where you got a bunch of lore experts. And it really, for those that don't know, it really brought interest in what was going on with this mysterious drifters and everything, the sleepers. Brought that all to the forefront for even players that weren't normally interested in that. So it was a really interesting time for lore, and I think it's changed ever since. And it culminated with a video later on that Ashterothi, your voice was in when the drifters were introduced, right?
Yeah, so it all started when Carolina Grace was in a hauling ship one day, and she posted on Twitter a picture that basically said, "Hey, is this star getting brighter?" And we tracked it over a couple of days, and it was every day it was getting bigger. And so eventually this was known as Caroline's Star. And at that exact same time, we started seeing the Circadian Seekers show up, the structures, the Jovian Towers, as we now know them, but they were once unidentified observatories. They start showing up, and it was obvious that something was happening. And so I had no idea what it was. I knew that there wasn't much that I knew about the lore in that sense at the time. And so what I did was I found everyone who I'd ever heard their name and the word lore in the same sentence together, and I messaged them, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to be part of this panel?" And so we got together the first lore panel, and it was like 8 or 9 people. And it was people from all different disciplines, Ravis and Mark 726, and if I keep trying to list off names, the people who I forget are going to be the ones that get mad at me. So a whole bunch of people, and it was really awesome because it wasn't just the Emergent Threats trailer. They made several scope videos about this topic. This was during the height of scope videos, when they were coming out literally every week. And so one of them, they talk about these scientists are discussing the options of what this is, and they showed all of our characters from behind, and I'm like, "Oh God, that's awesome!" And we all celebrated it and everything, but little do we know that in the background, CCP actually messaged Phiridian and was like, "Hey, can we use some of the audio from your lore panel for something?" And he was like, "Sure, why not?" Didn't think anything about it. And so then that fan fest, they came out with the Emergent Threats trailer, which took audio from our lore panel and put it together with some really good video footage, and kind of caught everybody up with what is happening with Caroline Star.
Yeah. So there was let me wrap this up for you. But they ended up taking a lot of what you did, a lot of the work that you and, of course, Phiridian did, Lockfox 2, and they put it into the game, which was happening at the time. As a lot of player characters were getting highlit on trailers that were being presented back into the community. And it was also serving to explain a lot of the things that were happening in the game that weren't related to player activity, but related to the environment changing, which all of that is what we see today with Triglavians and drifters and these towers. And so if you want to know where all that started, it started around this time. And one of the pioneers of that was Ashterothi with Phiridian.
Yeah, it was associated with, I believe, the Rubicon expansion, maybe just after, because that was the idea, was that the CCP had this plan for this change to the world. It was all part of CCP Siegel's vision and all this kind of stuff. And so Rubicon was crossing the Rubicon. It was the beginning of the series of events that we are still playing out today. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. It definitely defines us even today. Go ahead, Elise.
I was going to say, it got the Ashteroth's podcast also got me super into the lore, and so much to the point where I tried out for the Amar Championships, actually. So
that's right.
And ever since then, I've been deeply fascinated by the lore. Before that, I was like, these are cool, whatever. But because of the Know Your Lore type things from the Hydrostatic podcast, I was like, that's when I started to get into it. So it's when Matterall says people from that wouldn't normally be associated with the lore in the video game, in EVE Online, he definitely means it. When you're talking about FCs from mercenary alliances getting into the lore, that's kind of a big deal.
Right. And so again, it helped bring lore to the forefront of the game. CCP was doing that too. It helped integrate players into the backstory of the game, which was happening. We still have that happening today. The explanation of drifters and all that kind of stuff was starting at that time. And you also had talking in stations. A little guy named Matterall, or Paulo at the time, said, wow, those guys are amazing. I think I'll do a podcast since I was editor at Eve News 24 called Eve News 24 Podcast. I reached out to Ash and said, hey, man, you think you could give me some advice? And that's how I started on podcasting. And then I went over to Imperium News right in time for what was starting to happen. The World War B was actually, it was Kickstarter that was happening. So TMC was in kind of meltdown mode at the time. So I came in and helped stabilize it and start generating content for it. I started writing for it, and then I started doing all the artwork and the website. And then I transitioned, with the help of many others, TMC to INN. And all that was happening while World War B Casino War was happening. So let's go to that.
Well,
back to
actually, so the pivot point there, in my opinion, was Eve Vegas. So Eve Vegas 2015, like all of the Hydrostatic podcast people were there. There's a lot of the other lore people there. You were there. I believe that's actually where the transition from Eve News to
right after that,
INN, what is now INN, happened. But it's also just it's where the Citadel expansion was announced, and it was where the Imperium book Kickstarter was announced, which I believe was kind of the first trigger point that led off to the series of events that led to World War B.
Elise, tell us what you know about the backstory. You might have been more involved with the actual planning of it, and I can talk about later, like when I investigated, I did another piece called Inside the War Between. Well, I did a couple articles on this that were big and I considered definitive because they went into a bunch of stuff. But one thing I never had access to was what you might have been privy to, which is what was going on in the back rooms around that time.
So when it comes to everyone at the time, the goons had this massive target on their back, and were they still called the CFC, or had they moved to the Imperium? I think they had moved to the Imperium.
They had.
They had just rebranded as Imperium.
Yeah. So the Imperium were wildly successful. They had never been taken out of their space. Declan was the one region in EVE Online that had never been conquered in the entire decade. Every other region had swapped hands. The one difference was Declan. So everyone was like, hey, how do we fight these goons? People from NC Dot wanted to fight the goons, but they could never eventually do it. They had kind of like the Fountain War happened, so when Test gets involved, then Test shatters, and so like the idea of having the numbers is officially gone, right? Because PL and NC Dot together could not get the same number that the Imperium had. Like, no one could match the Imperium, so they were the big bad. They were, for all intents and purposes, they were the new band of brothers. It seemed like they had won Eve. There was no way to beat them. And so everyone tried to theory craft different ways to fight them. Pro God Legend was like one of the, probably the number one guy who wanted to see them go down. The same with Manfred Sidious. They would always come up with different plans on how to fight the goons. So after Pandemic Legion has their foray with Brave Newbies in the South, I get a message from someone named Lenny Kravitz too, who is a banker at iWantEsk, has a bunch of money, and his goal in life is he wants to kill goons. And I'm like, okay, I've heard this story 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. Here's like, it's completely impractical to do it, but here's how I would do it if I were you. And then I put him in contact, and I basically said you had to invade them without making them seem like they were being invaded, cut off a lot of their allies, and then eventually leave it so it's just Goon Swarm Federation by itself with none of their friends. Which, it sounds like John Madden saying, oh, you just have to take the ball and score it in the other person's thing. Like, it's super simplistic and it's obvious to anybody. But I put him in contact with a few people like Manfred Sidious, who had a thing for going after goons, and Pro God Legend and a few other people. And then I just dropped it. I was like, okay, well, that was a fun little hour-long experiment. I'll see what. I'm sure nothing will come of this. But things did come of it. Lenny Kravitz too started a Skype channel and invited literally every person you can imagine that wasn't in the Imperium into the channel to kind of theory craft how they're going to do it. And he was offering so much ISK to people just to get involved.
Except when you came into that channel, you found that he invited who accidentally?
Yeah, so he had accidentally and incidentally invited the Mittani into that Skype channel as well. And so when I was there, I was like, hey, do you know who this guy is? Like, the Mittani's in your channel to take down his empire, right? Like, and he was like, oh no. So we quickly removed him, but he'd been in there for weeks.
Yeah, it was not on the Mittani character. It was a different account, but it was well known.
Yeah, it was on his because at the time we weren't using Discord. Everyone was still on the Skype. So that was fun. But eventually, like, the ball gets rolling by people just getting involved, and Pandemic Legion like didn't start the whole thing. Not in the longest stretch. Like a bunch of other people got involved first. But I do think probably the most important development that led to World War B or the Casino War, whatever you feel like calling it, is something that I think it's overlooked quite. After BTAC-R, Vili, who is the CFC campaign commander for the Halloween War, he takes a break and ends up getting purged from Goon Swarm. I'm probably butchering how the story actually goes down, so hopefully we'll have Vili on to clear it up. But Vili is no longer in Goons. He's been synonymous with Goons for the longest time. Likewise, Nully Secunda with Pro God Legend had completely died. Actually, Goons had hired PL to kill Nully Secunda.
That's right.
So that happened.
And you did.
And we did, yeah. And we absorbed Killa B from Nully Secunda, who would play a crucial role later. But crucially, Vili and Pro God Legend both found their way into Test Alliance Please Ignore, who was they're very much still rebuilding after Hero Coalition. But they added some sense of, like, I don't know, legitimacy to Test. Like Vili joining Test, I think, made Test a new powerhouse, or at least they gave them the structure to be a powerhouse. So that's like crucial before World War B happens. If that move doesn't happen, if Vili doesn't come back and join Test, I think the Imperium as we know it stays in Declan and World War B fails. That's how serious I am about it.
Wow. History.
So groups start fighting the Imperium. They start fighting back. Pandemic Legion and NC Dot eventually rotate over and start taking out allies on the western flank. Imperium were like, what? They're not going to take us. Just regroup back to Declan, and we'll fight them from there. But internally, people thought in the Imperium that was a little bit tone deaf. Of like, hey, we don't care about your space that's getting lost. We're not going to always help. Just come back, chill on our couch. You can be our couch dwellers, and then we'll take care of it together. So the group started to fracture, and then as those groups started to fracture, the World War B thing just snowballed out of control. You're talking like the 10 groups that started it overnight turned into 40 groups. Everyone saw that the Goons could bleed a little bit, and then just snowballed horribly against them. They were like, we want to be in on this fight.
Well, there's a couple of things. Let me interject. There's a couple of things going on here. One is Lenny, if you remember, he's one of the Brave guys, right? He was a financier of Brave. He's turned his money to this use. He's associated with a group called I Want ISK, which is basically a casino, which is why it's called the Casino War for some people. And he hears that the owner of the casino, a guy named Eep, is angry at Space Monkeys, or Space Monkeys Alliance, because they have mistreated some of his bankers and he knows them very well because he was in space. Was it Space Monkeys? What is it?
SMA, Space Monkey Alliance.
SMA,
right?
it is, right? Okay. I don't know. I'm thinking Sea Monkeys, and I'm like, oh, I'm getting it wrong.
Nope.
Yeah. So anyway, there is an internal struggle that allows even more financial heft to be brought to bear because Eep says, I'm really mad at these guys, SMAs. Anybody have any mercenaries they can contact? And this is also pivotal because you see this money that was created outside the game by bored Eve players, essentially, and this is from Caleb's term, they monetized boredom, which is brilliant. So all that time where people don't have something to do, they're gambling away on this I want ISK. They get billions and billions, hundreds of billions, and trillions of ISK, and they don't know what to do with it. So they start pouring it into mercenaries. And Lenny happens to be in the room when Eep says, does anybody know any mercenaries? And that's all happening at the same time.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like moving pieces.
Oh, go ahead, Ash, and then Elise.
Yeah, well, there's two other pieces to this that was really important, in my opinion. First of all, to go way back a little bit, CCP wanted to make a book, and so they put out this request for all these different stories of different players, and what they chose was Goonswarm Federation's taking down of Bob, and it was called Eve True Stories. There it is right there. If you can't see it. It was a series of comics that were made by Dark Horse Comics, and it was pretty successful. And then after that, there was a second book that was written. This was by Andrew Groen, known as Empires of Eve, and it was Kickstarted. And that Kickstarter asked for roughly about $15,000, I think, and raised over $90,000. Yeah, 10. That's right. So then eventually the Imperium were like, hey, we could do this too. So they find this professional military history, like fictional history writer, to write the book of the Fountain War from like their perspective, basically. And they launched this Kickstarter starting at the E Vegas, but they asked for $150,000, which really kind of took people back. And they didn't ever raise anywhere close to that. I think they got to 35,000 before they pulled it. But that really put the Imperium's name back in everybody's face, and in an antagonistic kind of way, or in a maybe even just a mocking kind of way, as people were really like it was a very big deal of something to happen. And then right after that, because it seemed like the Mittani got angry at the fact that everybody had kind of laughed at this whole project, he declared war on Losec and announced that he was going to have some sort of viceroy system, in which case, like people will have to like bend the knee to the Imperium, even if they're in Losec or anywhere. And that was a big rallying point for the low-sec entities, who then formed together. You know, we've been fighting for years and years and years. The pirate lords and the faction warfare dudes and all these guys that just fight every single day against each other all looked at this and said, you know what? We form up when something outside comes and threatens us. And so Voltron was also born. And so from that, you have SMA beginning to bleed. SMA gets attacked. Imperium kind of write off SMA. They basically say, well, they're not really Imperium proper. We're going to let this one go. But I think that everybody else that were allies of Goons kind of saw that and was like, wait, when are we going to get written off? You know? And I think this is one of the reasons why the idea of like naming the war became so important, because this idea of like the Goon Swarm, whether or not the Imperium was the Imperium, i.e. everybody, or whether or not the Imperium was Goon Swarm, was one of the central questions of World War B. To the point where when CCP came out with the background for the characters, they put little bees in the background of that one, and the Imperium got super mad because it wasn't about Goon Swarm to them.
So Ash touches on something that's super critical here. And before this war even got its name, the people that were in the group fighting against the Imperium they called themselves the Money Badger Coalition, which is a play on the Honey Badger Coalition that had existed a few years before. But because they were all being paid quite well and handsomely, they're like, oh, let's just call us the Money Badger Coalition. But everyone within the coalition felt like they were crucial to the entire war effort. And interestingly enough, everyone that was involved was crucial to the war effort, right? So everyone thought that they were like the tip of the spear, and they all were right. They were all the tip of the spear. And that's why it became so daunting to happen. So as Space Monkeys gets written off, more and more people get written off. So, people that are in Vale, like I think Lon are in Vale, they get called back. Bastion relocate. CO2 is still fighting the good fight in Tribute. And so like no one can kind of get through there because GigaX is just a monster of an FC who will keep fighting. So the Money Badgers like pivot over to like Branch and Venal and Tenal and those areas, trying to make inroads. And because of Phoebe and because it's so far, the Goon Swarm, like no matter where they move to, they're pretty much screwed, and they need like something's going to give. So they basically make the decision to hold around Tribute. They find their strongest and most competent ally in CO2. And they're like, okay, these guys have their act together. They fight, they form up for timers. We can trust them. We're going to prop up this strongest wall to make sure it doesn't fall, because no one's mad enough to take Declan. Who cares if someone takes Venal, Tenal, and Branch? They can't live there if we hold Tribute. So they make the right call. They prop up Tribute and kind of fortify that entire area. And FCs from Goonswarm, they are committed to helping out FCon in Branch and Venal in that area. So they show up time and time again to these timers, and there are a few miscommunications, right? So there's a little bit of bloat within the Imperium because they've just been going on for so long without really a test. So eventually, FCon, they form up like 1,100 people on their own, and Goons get there a little bit late because they got interdicted by one of the other groups from the Money Badger Coalition. And then FCon's like, you know what, screw this. We're out. We can't trust these Goon guys. And this is, well, obviously they remain on good terms, but they're just like really frustrated, as you get in a war when you feel like everyone's on your back.
Right. That's one of the things that's happening. This may be the last ingredient, but as you've heard, there are multiple ingredients that all kind of had to happen for this massive group that became known as Money Badgers to form and to put pressure on what was the Imperium's Northern Empire, which was the CFC Empire before that. And that was this technological change. Discord came around. And I think that allowed these groups to manage to coordinate their efforts without having to give away security information to get one group into another. How big a role do you think that played, Elise?
It played a really big role, right? As you mentioned, it's a way to get people together and coordinate, which was the big thing. And World War B, Casino War, was all about the coordination. And it's something that Goonswarm had found themselves lacking. They for whatever reason, they had found themselves with 2 or 3 strat level FCs that remained from their glory days. And on the other side, you had like a former Goonswarm strat level FC that was like kind of leading the charge. So you had Villy in the Money Badger Coalition saying, hey, here's what they're going to do. I know because this is what I would do if I were them. And then you had Killa B, who was just absolutely relentless in his willingness to form. And then you had people like all over, even like people from Mercenary Coalition, even like random like low sec entities that were hitting, like they all felt and they were all treated like they were equals, which was huge. It was like the Imperium against the Imperium in a sense.
Right. And interestingly,
one thing I want to correct. I said that the book was going to be from the Imperium's perspective, and I've been corrected by several people that it was meant to be a neutral telling of the story.
Oh, yeah, I didn't hear that part.
So I just wanted to make that correction.
Yeah, it was the first of hopefully many books, and they were going to cover many battles and kind of glorify Eve to a greater population to draw in new players. It was all very noble. One of the problems was they started with the Fountain War, which happened to be a war that they won, and so then it looked a little self-serving. But going back to, I just lost my point there, Elise. What was the last thing you said?
So basically, we were talking about Discord and how it kind of made the Money Badgers an organized group that could, hit on multiple fronts at the same time.
Oh,
and I was talking about the war in the North with FCON eventually pulling back. And in EVE Online, no matter how impartial you try to be, you will always make mistakes. And I made a mistake on that one. It wasn't really like FCON didn't get super frustrated. I'm sure they were frustrated, but the pulling back, it wasn't in bad faith or anything. They just wanted a sense of safety, and they didn't feel it. Right. So they pulled back closer to the motherland of Declan, rather than getting frustrated.
Okay, we'll get into the battles that happened during World War B. I'll just kind of call it World War B, but I mean Casino War II. Because it was very interesting what you said there. I didn't know, and that was that all the leaders felt like they were very important and critical and involved. And that's how, and you basically had the Imperium going against the Imperium. In other words, a well-organized, big, blobbing machine. And that's what it felt like on the ground as an actual fighter, because it was honey badgers that would show up with more members than the Imperium. And that had never been the case before. And it happened twice in a row. And each time, I remember the first fight, we showed up with, me being part of the honey badgers at the time, well, the Imperium showed up with 800 people, which is very, very substantial. And Money Badgers showed up with 1,400. And that was like an astounding number. Wow, we've outblobbed the Imperium. And then the next fight that followed, the Imperium matched that 1,400 and arrived with about that many fighters. And the Money Badgers, by that point, was euphoric. They arrived with 2,200. And that was a huge fight. So the point is, like, all the stuff that the Imperium was known for at the time had shifted over to the attacking Honey Badgers coalition, which is very interesting.
Yeah, in a way, they were victims of their own success, right? So people took that playbook and they were like, this is the right way to do things. Let's go ahead and use this again. Well, and so then cracks started to form.
Historically, you couldn't really get those personalities to work together very well, right? Like, it always seemed to fall apart because the leadership couldn't agree on things, it seemed like, or
that's exactly true. The war against the Imperium has been attempted and failed dozens of times because people were just like, screw you, I don't want to work with you, I don't like the way you're talking to me about this.
So something changed there that allowed the leadership to feel unified. Maybe it was new leadership because Killaby was new. Villy was on the other side now, so he was technically new. And you also had Discord, which allowed the coordination technology needed by all these people without giving up any security for their own alliance and corporation for future importance. And I think those two things combined make it very interesting that you could unify that many people, which was needed in order to overcome the wall of the Imperium in the north.
And I think one thing that is often overlooked by the people that were on the Money Badger side, and it's very easy to overlook because at the end of the day, no one cared about the ISK. But at the start of the day, the ISK is what got those people to work together to begin with. There were dozens of times in the early days where people were like, I hate working with these guys, but the money's good, so I'm going to keep on doing it. Before that snowball started to roll down the mountain, while it was still just like a flake or two at the top.
Well, you had more.
I remember like a year before that all of this happened. I think it was you and me, at least, that was talking about the idea. The question came up, what would it take to take down the Imperium? And the decision was it would take Infinite ISK and basically the rest of New Eden. And then, therefore, we had Infinite ISK and basically the rest of New Eden.
Yeah. And so, hilariously, what ends up playing the biggest role in all of this, I think, or one of the biggest roles, is propaganda. Because the propaganda is what really gets people in EVE Online going. It's what get line members to sit in tie-dye for 6-7 hours a day for weeks. Everyone likes to feel like they're winning. So there's a propaganda guy named Joachim Weiss, who is a name you probably don't remember, but he used to be in Black Legion and made all of their great videos that made Black Legion so sought after to be. And he ends up joining Pandemic Legion a few months beforehand, and he comes up with this idea on his own of this propaganda like smear piece to kind of boost people within PL who are kind of they didn't really want to work with other people not so much. They're like, we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So he puts out this video, and he ends up calling it, because Killer B was an FC for Pandemic Legion, he ends up calling it World War B, which it just hits everything right. And he makes this really funny video that Maccloud just played a few minutes before with like it's just all memes more or less that are just propaganda
like
memes.
World War II newspaper with heroes and with newspapers about headlines.
It gets people like so excited and so amped up, and the name just works perfectly because it's Killer B, goons are bees. It's so simple. And that's really the turning point where everyone, as Matterall was saying before, the 800 turned to 1400, turned to 2200, turned to 3000. So everyone just wants to get in on this action.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we could go on for 8 hours and probably still have a lot more to say, but Imperium essentially has to do a strategic retreat. They retreat to Lowsec.
Well, there's a big piece of this that I think we skipped, and then once we get that, then I think we can pretty much lock down the rest of it, which is that after SMA collapsed, the next person in line was CO2. That was the next wave of the buffer, and when the CO2 Keepstar was attacked after this, at the second fight, CO2 actually betrayed and left the Imperium. And not only did they do that, but they handed over to the Money Badger Coalition a list of every single Titan under construction by the Imperium. And that cinched the deal. At that point, it went from like, well, we don't know if the Imperium are going to make it or fight back or whatever. And that was when it was like, okay, well, now we're just going to be trying to like tactically retreat while these people burn everything they possibly can.
Yeah, the flip of CO2 is what made the entire war change, right? As it happened overnight too. So as we mentioned before,
it happened mid-battle.
Yeah, the Imperium had like noticed that CO2 was the strongest wall, and they had made the decision to keep that, to fortify that as best as they could. They'd show up to the things. CO2 felt like they were alone in holding back the masses of people trying to invade, and they got so frustrated internally, and I'm sure there are other people at CO2 who can attest to this a little bit better. But GigX made the decision. He was like, you know what? Screw these guys. I'm done. I don't feel like I'm being treated like an equal. They're not helping me as much as I want them to help me. So I'm flipping to the other guys. And he approached Killaby, he approached Villy, and like one or two other people. And I was like, hey, I've got an idea.
You approached Villy. That's news. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was Villy and Killaby together, where GigX went. And so he was like, hey, so if we call it quits, what's in it for us? And so those guys just like rolled out the red carpet for him. They're like, well, you can keep all the stuff you can do. We don't care. Just do it. Just do it. It'll be fun. Do it for the memes. And eventually it happened. Yeah.
I'll give you anything you want.
So eventually it happened. So not only is the Money Badger Coalition matching people of the Imperium, which is unheard of, they also remove and flip the strongest ally that the Imperium have, which is where the Imperium put all of their forces to try and prop up and keep strong. So it was just like a colossal failure. on all fronts for the Imperium. Like you just can't rebound from it. There's nothing that you can do. You can't remove and reposition your entire fleet. You can't put new allies in tribute after it's occupied. You can't do anything. So they do the only sensible thing, and they go to Losec and just chill, and just wait for the storm to be over. They wait for everything to be glass. They wait for the parades to end.
So a couple of points that need to be re-emphasized, and one is this is why people fight over the title of this war, because World War B signifies that you're fighting Goon Swarm alone. And there was a lot of psychological warfare about tearing off their allies, like CO2 and FCON, for instance. And so there was basically a lot of, hey guys, we're not interested in you. We're going after Declan. We're going after the Goon Swarm. So if you just get out of the way, we'll be, we won't hurt you, basically. And I think inside a Goon Swarm, looking at that was an assault of their unification, their organization. And so what they responded to was when CCP is trying to identify the war in order to make some propaganda for the public, they end up using the popular World War B name, and that ends up causing a lot of strife inside of Goon Swarm, against CCP, that CCP is picking a side and that sort of stuff. So that's what's going on there. And in the meantime, Matani says, well, we'll call this one the War of Sovless Aggression, which basically means all the people that don't care about Sov, that don't want Sov, they're not empire builders, and those are the guys that are declaring war on the empire. And you, CCP, have made mechanics that makes this possible. So this is the War of Sovless Aggression, based off the American Civil War, War of Southern Aggression. And that is an interesting thing to unpack, because he's pointing out that these guys that don't care about, they're all nomadic mercenaries, basically, are allowed to basically win the game. And I think they were pretty upset about that. So that's what
the theme here was, that there was nothing for the Imperium to strike back at, right?
Right.
None of their enemies had Sov, so they couldn't attack their Sov, and their money came from this casino, which was also unassailable. So this idea of like, well, there's nothing we can do. The only thing we can do is sit here and defend for as long as we can. There's no counterattack possible, was one of the strongest narratives that the Imperium had.
And for the record, probably the most broken mechanic to have ever existed in EVE Online is player-owned casinos. And this includes doomsdays that can be fired through a Sino remotely. Like the fact that player-owned casinos could make money and have this type of impact is, within the storied history of the game, is the most broken part of the game. Right. So after this, that gets dealt with and removed.
Right. Okay. So the point is, the title is still fought over. People fight over what this thing is called. Most popular probably is World War B. It's now changed to Casino War, which was coined by Noisy Gamer, not the Imperium, which was a good one because it describes that this was basically funded by casinos. But there you go. The other thing is, something else was happening at this time. You had the first Keepstar blueprint arrive right at the end of this war. And the first one was built in Hard Knox's Rage system, and that's a secret wormhole system. But the second one was put down by Darkness, by Sort Dragon's Darkness, and that was put down in Decline, wasn't it? And so when the first Keepstar arrives, I think there was a pivotal change there in the post-World War B area, because I think at the time that there were plans to slowly try to take Sov. They were trying to figure out how to take Sov back from the Money Badger coalition. So they were working on that, and they had made a little bit of progress, at least 1 or 2 weeks. But the progress was slow, and then the Keepstar was dropped. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, they have a castle in our lands. How will we ever get them out of a castle? And I think there was some kind of impetus also to move south because there was economic opportunity down there in what was basically a good area. But that's what happened post World War B, some of the thinking that was going on. Did you think that was an important thing, Elise, or was that just something that just happened at the same time, a coincidence?
I don't know. It's really hard to look at it objectively and kind of look back and kind of read into what was happened and what's not. I will say, like, with 2020 vision, the move of the Imperium and all their allies south to delve,
some of their
allies. A lot of their allies, the ones that want to stay. I think that move south was the most advantageous thing for them in the long run, and it's easily the smartest decision that they made. They took a horrible, bitter defeat from the rest of the game against them and turned it into what would be the biggest win and setting the stage for the next 7 years of EVE Online.
Yeah. I wrote an article at the time saying that what they're doing in Delve, because they were at a very low point, right? Here I am, an NC guy running their newspaper, essentially. And I wrote an article, and I got a lot of grief for it. I got a lot of grief for a lot of articles from my NC buddies. But basically, I was saying, like, if Mittani can survive this and bring back Goonswarm, it will be the biggest comeback this game has ever seen. And I think it stands as, on a large scale, the biggest comeback. But let's talk about that. First, Keepstar goes down, and then Honey Badgers settle up north, and this thing comes up called New World Order. What do you know about that?
That's kind of a meme that PL started just to, like, oh, this is just going to be a thing. So
what was it meant to mean?
It's like the world after. It's like the post Imperium in Declan world and how it's going to play out. So a lot of people suspected that the Money Badgers would just replace the Imperium in the north, and a lot of the groups that were crucial there were like, oh no, that's not how this is going to work. You have Test Alliance and CO2 becoming very close allies, fighting up there, and then you have groups like PLN and CDOT saying, hey, we'll just take the low-hanging fruit over here and start fighting them. You have PL working with Goonswarm, some fleets. You have wormhole superhighways becoming the new meta. Well, they were the old meta before, but they became increasingly popular.
Right. It seemed to me that what you guys, because you kind of used this term and you were in leadership at the time, that it was also very much a way of gatekeeping Keepstars that went down. I don't know if you mentioned that. And there were some early on Keepstars that were put down, like the CO2 Keepstar Mtaco was put down. And then you had one that was put down by a group called Mayhem. And that one was targeted for destruction. And it was the first Keepstar destroyed was actually, what was the name of that group? Something Mayhem. Anyone remember?
I do not. I know it's not Total Mayhem. Project Mayhem. There you go.
Yeah. Fight Club reference.
Right. Oh, okay. And so they were the first. They had the first Keepstar destroyed, and it was destroyed by the remnants of the Money Badger coalition. Okay, so let's move on from money. Okay, so now
one more thing I want to point out from this era, as we talk about closing down World War B, was the casinos in the end that fall were banned from the game, and the reason why they were banned from the game largely was because of this war. CCP ultimately agreed that having this source of income that is unassailable outside of the game, disconnected, and effectively infinite, was ultimately hazardous to the game. So while things like gambling and raffles and all these things have always been an integral part of EVE, unfortunately, the consequence of these actions was to say that we can't have third-party gambling services anymore. And they all got shuttered down, and it actually happened in the middle of the Alliance tournament, I remember. So they were even like, okay, well, we're going to let you guys finish off the Alliance tournament, do all your betting on the Alliance tournament, and then after that, we're going to just shutter it all and we're going to move on. Right. I think that was a really big change, because organizations like EveBet were funding a lot of content creators. I know Crossing Zebras was basically bankrolled by EveBet. Heck, Eve Vegas basically got off the ground because of support from places like EveBet. Like the history of EveBet with the community and other gambling sites was huge. And so while it was true that for the sake of like Eve politics, these kinds of things were bad for the game, unfortunately, as a consequence to this, you start seeing this kind of collapse of various different content creating organizations as they struggle to continue to remain afloat in spite of this.
Funny enough, I was offered money to stop working for INN. At the time, was it TMC or it might have been INN at that point? But they were like, "We'll give you 30 to 50 billion a month if you stop. Just don't do anything. We'll pay you for doing nothing. Just stop working there." So they had money to throw around if they're going to pay people just to not work. But yeah, so shortly after that, they were banned. And that changed the whole paradigm of what was actually worth, because again, more casinos were being built in order to cash in on this. They'd seen the power of it with now that massive amount of money that you could collect from people's boredom time infused into the game politically. People thought that's the thing to do. So let's get on that. And so you saw, at least I think there were 2 other casinos that were being built at the time, and all that got shut down, and 3 people were banned from the game that kind of led that, including Lenny, the guy who found the mercenaries for I Want ISK, and Iron Bank, who was also affiliated with I Want ISK. And then you had a new guy that was building a new casino that was banned for before he got started. So those were the guys that were all taken out when that happened. And that was a pivotal change, because now the actual way to make money was through empire building, it looked like. And Delve had a head start.
Yeah, we do have to speed it up a little bit as we get to more recent memory, but it's crucial to point out that the framework that made Delve popular, which was like orchestrated by like the Imperium people, it was not only was it like ridiculously strong. Obviously, there were like a few game changes that happened. Rorqual got very strong, but the idea of sitting in an area, building it up, and inviting basically anyone that wants to come in as like a form of like manifest destiny and stuff, and just empire building in that way was so powerful. And the Imperium not only identified this and created it, but they got a 2-year head start on anybody. And in that time, they ended up making a super capital armada that is bigger to date than we have seen at all. And they went from the lowest of lows to setting up the highest of highs that they could possibly do in the span of 9 months. And I think when we look back on Eve, even probably in the next decade, we can probably just say, you know, that was the turning point that changed the game forever.
Yeah. To this day, it is a big factor in what's going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about Delve. Okay, so what do we know about Delve and how it started? The early days in Delve, what was going on?
So after the Money Badgers kind of forced the Imperium out of the north and the Imperium moved to the south, there was a small group led by ProGod Legend that wanted to go south to Delve and finish off Goons once and for all. It didn't get a lot of popularity. People were super burned out. People were annoyed at having to deal with one another. So there was a small contingent that went that way, kind of ran flat, and then Delve was left alone for all intents and purposes to be built up.
Yeah, they used to call it cracks forming in the north, right? That was the funny part. Like, yeah, that Money Badger coalition is falling apart slowly. So one of the first breaks was that NC Dot and CO2 got into a fight. Test was pulled in because they were an ally. And so that was the first major keep star. The defended keep star was an MTACO, belonged to CO2, was destroyed by basically Northern Coalition and Pandemic Legion.
Yep, which is quite crucial, because then those guys say, you know what, we're taking our ball, we're going home, or we're going south. So they go to the other side of the map. They literally pick the furthest point that they could get from PLN and Sedat and say, we're going to go here together. And that's when Legacy Coalition kind of, the roots start to grow there. And they would end up being obviously a powerhouse, is what they are now.
Right, because CO2 was in Legacy to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And then they invite Brave along with them. That's probably why Legacy's name is, because they're the Hero Coalition. But who knows what the name was picked for? I actually don't know the answer to that. But here you have CO2, Brave, and Test forming an alliance. They're coming down, and already in the area you have FCON, who's being attacked by Triumvirate, and you also have Stain, who's in there. So basically, Legacy forms in Catch, right in the middle of FCON and the Imperium. And it was a big question: is the Imperium going to go and attack these groups that they're really mad at because of World War B? And they do attack with Stain, but Stain is so weak that the Imperium says, well, if they're not going to fight, we're not going to fight for them, so we back off too. And so the nascent Legacy coalition is allowed to plant itself and start to grow.
Yep, and that becomes huge because they become arguably the second strongest coalition in the game, maybe third, depending on how you view it. But they get very, very strong down there in the south, while the people in the north are still kind of fighting one another and kind of deciding on what to do.
So I think the next important thing that happens is there's a guy by the name of Harvey Skywalker, and he's the leader of the Culture. He's a Black Legion guy, and he lives in in Fountain, and he's conquered Fountain. He's beating up on the locals, which are called Fountain Corps, and they're like tribal people that never leave. I think they're Hungarian, if I'm not mistaken, and they just always like live there until the occupiers leave, and then they take over again. So he's been suppressing them for a while, and he decides this is not really for them anymore. His guys need better activity. So he sells Fountain to the Imperium. And this creates a strategic advantage for the Imperium to be able to travel north through Fountain and into Pureblind and Fade, and to attack what was the Money Badger Coalition up there, which would be Darkness, Horde, and not necessarily NCPL, but getting kind of close to where NC is. And that is really when, in order to keep activity, the Imperium sends up special interest groups, SIGs, up north to kind of harass Horde and to harass their Horde's bigger brother at the time, Guardians of the Galaxies, which we now know as Dead Coalition, right? So basically, Gobbins, who's the leader of Horde, and Sword Dragon are working together against these Imperium SIGs that are now coming up through Fountain. And later what happens is that basically Horde gets tired of being that wall between the Imperium and Guardians of the Galaxies. So they decide they're going to move away to Geminate because they need more room. And so they move over to Geminate. And now Guardians of the Galaxies is kind of alone to be harassed by an ever-growing group of Imperium fighters that are coming up. And so what can you tell us about this era? This is right before 9TAC4, even before that, like when they...
I think this is where Horde starts realizing their place in the universe, right? Okay. They started as a new player group in light of Brave Newbies and Karma. And I think at this point they realize that they can do so much more. They can be a power player. They can do essentially whatever they want. They are valuable. So they start asserting their dominance and their weight in what they have, because they've gone from a bunch of newer players that have veteran assistance to new players that have assets, they have skills, they can fly cohesive doctrines, they can fly battleships. They're no longer the support fleets for everyone. They can sit by themselves and just exist. They can go toe to toe with the biggest groups out there. And I think this is when they start to realize it. And part of that is with their leadership. I know we always attribute their leadership exclusively to Gobbins, but it's not just Gobbins. There are other people involved. So when they move to Geminid, it's them very much saying, "Hey, we're a player now. You have to deal with it." I don't think it was a mutual decision for them to leave. I think Sword Dragon would have loved to get them to stay because,
but they
were great.
I think that's the beginning. I may be wrong. The beginning of the rift between Gobbins and Sword Dragon is happening at this point.
Yeah, there's a power shift for sure where Horde starts becoming stronger, and they can make deals without having to look at their other allies. They can just sit by themselves and make deals unilaterally that interests them and them alone, which they end up doing quite a lot during the rest of the decade. And also, I think one of the big things that we have to mention, and I'm not very up to how this happens. Hopefully, Maccloud can chime in, or at least maybe one of you guys can as well. But one of the biggest developments is the Initiative as like an Imperium ally. That as soon as Fountain gets purchased by the Imperium, they start settling there. And they end up taking the mantle, I would say probably from PL, as being that boogeyman in the closet that you're afraid of. And they gain a lot of momentum. And I think they become the spookiest alliance that you're always afraid of, and that can always hit above their weight. And them being on the Imperium side is like another huge benefit to the Imperium as they rebuild.
Right. And during this time, you also have in Lowsec, Ash, maybe you could talk about this. What was going on in Lowsec and in faction war around this time? This is like 2017, I think.
Yeah. Well, Citadels kind of marked the end of the golden era of faction warfare, which began in Inferno. The introduction of Citadels really changed the way that the wars were fought, both mechanically and psychologically. It took us about a year to fully process like all of the effects of it, but basically what it boils down to is if you join faction warfare, you voluntarily get locked out of any structures within Lowsec that is owned by the enemy militia. And this is important because it makes it so that the defenders can reship in system, and the attackers have to go to the system next door in order to reship. But with the introduction of structures, you actually create this environment in which you cannot stop people from being able to use one of these structures in order to, perform a siege. And so both the Caldari and the Galente for a long time fight. I think this is about the same time as like Ascension, which was the introduction of alpha clones, which was also a huge deal. That actually briefly reinvigorated everything. But I know that there were several high-tiered sieges. I don't remember exactly which systems it was, but both Galente sieged the Caldari and the Caldari sieged Galente. And in both cases, the other side fought really, really hard. But then within about a week or so, that the siege was able to grind down the opponent. And this was kind of the theme, and it was understood that basically no system was 100% safe as long as these structures existed. The Galente, when the Alpha program came out, the Caldari gained a whole bunch of new people because of that, started burning the northern side of the war zone. However, we rallied and defended the south, and then ultimately formed what would later become Federation Uprising, and started to take back the war zone. At that point, the Caldari kind of got beaten back again, and the leadership kind of became disillusioned by it all completely. And so a lot of the Caldari guys go off and take Sov, which makes it so that we kind of steamroll the rest of the war zone, and then everybody's kind of like, well, now what? And so the rest of us all go take Sov. So we create Freedom Ring out in Cloud Ring, and kind of faction warfare. Yeah, we being the Galente militia, Galmilistan, and kind of faction warfare begins to kind of grind to a halt when it comes to the actual like conflict, territory ownership side of things, and is more or less left to default to the ISK farmers.
Right, which comes up later. Okay, so what's happening at this point in the South is that FCON is being warred by Triumvirate, who's going to kill him or die in the process, going to kill him or die trying. And both happen. FCON dies, and so does the Phoenix Coalition. And you also have Triumvirate in that time also disintegrates shortly after that, mostly because their leader takes off.
Sorry, there's one other piece to that somebody just reminded me of. I'm sorry.
What's that? Go ahead.
Another big piece of this is that Snuff, right? So I told you that there was the Voltron system where all of the low-sec entities kind of teamed up together to join World War B. And Snuff, on their way back home, backstabbed, I think it was Shadow Cartel.
It was Shadow,
and this fractured Snuff into two pieces, Escalating Entropy and Snuff proper. And so that kind of created this struggle. But then Snuff goes and kind of joins the Imperium and makes nullsec money, and then comes back to lowsec, kind of betrays the Imperium, doesn't support them anymore, comes back to lowsec with all their Titans, and proceeds to just burn all of Black Rise. And so at that point, basically, that was the other thing that kind of brought everything down. Now it's like, well, you can only do so much before 15 Titans show up or whatever. So it really changed the way that lowsec functioned.
Okay, and then and you also have Drone Region Federation is growing weak because their leader in XX Death essentially is gone too, and it's run by some diplomats that kind of screw some things up and accidentally get them into a war with Northern powers, which wins Manfred Sidious, who's come back into the game and is working in the DRF, Drone Region Federation. He comes back as a general, wins a really crucial battle when GOTG tries to put down a staging Keepstar in their territory. But after that, GOTG is able to really wreck DRF industrial base pretty much up in that area. And you also have wormholers, or I don't know if they're actual wormholers, but Hard Knocks, and I think Volta, if I'm not mistaken, is part of that. And this new group called Skill U forms, all to attack Drone Region Federation. Skill U is actually a tournament group, basically made out of a confederation of pizza, which is just group. And so those groups start to ravage Drone's area and weaken it and weaken it and weaken it, and all of a sudden the place basically implodes. And so you have what's called the Holy Roman Empire, which is a renting empire, paid to Skill U. And at the same time, you have the rise of a new time zone power. The Chinese players are no longer on their own server. A lot of them are coming to Tranquility. So Elise, we're talking about the rival of Winter Coalition.
Yeah, that's huge, right? So before it was just Wind Spirits and Fraternity, and then, as you mentioned, more people move over from Serenity, and all the coalitions start to court them because they see how big these guys might become.
Well, they formed their own coalition. There's one other little battle that's happening here. It's very interesting, and I don't have a lot of personal exposure to it, but inside of Great Wildlands, there's people who are being attacked by a group called Ebola. And so you have this group of locals, smaller tribes that basically say, look, they're going to kill us all, so we need to form up and fight back. Now, the smart play is normally you don't tell people you're going to kill them. You just slowly kill them, and you reassure everybody around that it's not going to happen to them. And then you work through them one at a time because they never unify, because they never perceive you as a threat to them.
No. This isn't a war. This is just an operation. It's just a small group. We're just exploring things, having fun, good fights.
Right. So Ebola does the exact wrong thing and says, we're going to take you all out. So all those little tribes say, let's get together and resist this. And they do, and they break Ebola and win. And that was a really cool little thing happening in Great Wildlands area. And a lot of those groups actually fall into Winter Coalition, this Chinese coalition that's coming up, led by Fraternity. And at a certain point, and it could be at Talking in Stations when Villy was ridiculing Wind Spirits on what he said about Chinese players being good and that sort of stuff. But anyway, there is tension between Legacy and Winter Coalition, which leads to skirmishing. And the skirmishing turns into a full-blown war before it stops with a non-invasion pact for a while. And that brings us kind of into the modern era. That at the beginning of 2019, we're going to go back for some stuff, but I just want to kind of explain. At the beginning of 2019, Winter and Legacy go to war in earnest for the entire year of 2019. Okay, going back though, big things are happening in the year before that. 2018 is the biggest battles that Eve has ever seen. They actually dwarf BTAC-R in scale, but not in importance, I would say. Let's talk about what happened in 2018 with the massive wars of the Titans.
So basically, as we mentioned before, the Imperium were left to rebuild in Delve after the conflict that sent them down there. And they did it better than anyone else. They figured out the meta of building these supercaps, putting people in space and using the space, like having it packed. They made it so no one wanted to go to Delve to attack Ratters or anything. And they ended up making this massive armada. And in the process, they also cultivated a lot of FCs as well, which was something that they had found lacking in their Casino War / World War B thing. So now they have FCs, they have this capital armada, which is something they never had before. And we're probably editorializing here a little bit, but they decide to flaunt their massive war machine and get a little bit of redemption against the powers that took their old homeland from them. And so they go ahead and go north, and they just lay waste to everything that goes in their path. There are some fights where it looks like it might go both ways, but the Imperium always seem to have a numbers advantage. And not only that, but they show themselves to be very capable in terms of FCing these super capital fights, which has not been their forte previously, like in their long history. But now they show that they're on the same level as everyone else. And they also, maybe they have a few tricks up their sleeve as well.
Well, let's explain that a couple of game changes have happened that make this even more possible, right? Like Discord really helped the unification of disparate groups fight the organized Imperium. But more changes have happened like that. One is you have skill injectors, which allow characters to be created, and you have the introduction of the Rorqual, which finally gets its buff after many years of being in the doghouse and not having any love. And it's able to mine solo the equivalent of 5 Hulks in nullsec space. So this creates a dynamic where a player can create multiple alts and skill inject them up into Rorquals, and those Rorquals can be protected by a centralized and local police force while they mine the heck out of the area. But all those minerals need to be absorbed, because otherwise they just sit on the market and drive the price down, 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 down. So they are absorbed by being used to build motherships or basically super carriers and Titans. And those are all being built like crazy. Oh, there's one other change. There's no bottleneck to building now, because these new engineering complexes allow you to build multiple capital ships in one area, in one structure. And of course, these are sprinkled all over Delve. So with these 3 things happening, with no bottlenecks on building, with a surplus of minerals, and the ability to generate those minerals enhanced by injectors and Rorqual advantages, all that leads to a massive proliferation of super capital ships, specifically in Delve.
So hilariously, if you were listening to the last the part one of this episode, we talked about the exact same thing happening, or at least a very similar thing. There's like a mechanics change, some area of space, and some group gets a lot of minerals, and they end up turning that into a super capital force and decimating the rest of the world. That was what happened to the old DRF, and now you see the Imperium doing the same thing. Recognizing a massive change, recognizing how these sotios and stuff can be used, and how to transform their minerals into supercap ships and titans. So every member gets to get one, more or less.
To one or two, right? Or three.
Yeah.
Grows. But so you have the people, and now you have the power. And you have the route, because Fountain now belongs to you. Initiative sits in it. And so you have a clear shot with a lot of power at the north. And that's what happens at the beginning of 2018 and happens all year long in the north. In the south, you have something that happens. Another change that CCP does is it says that NPC stations are going to convert to Fortizars. And when they convert, they'll be worth a lot of money. And one of the places that everybody's looking at is Providence. So Pandemic Legion moves into Providence, capturing those stations weeks before this deadline, because it's all going to happen at one moment at a certain time. And at the same time, Test, who's a little bit angry at Pandemic Legion, says, we're closer. We have our super capitals here. We can do this if we need to. And they take Providence from Pandemic Legion. And
they steal it like a week before, not even.
Right at the
they
last
get
second.
like 9.
Right at the last second, right? They come in, they take it from them, and that's a huge prize. I think, I forget the ISK value in that, but I think there were nearly 200 stations. I forget. I have it written down somewhere. But it's a huge prize, which makes Test very, very, very wealthy with faction Fortizars. It also gets PL kind of mad, because I think they're looking at this saying like, well, we can only do so much with dreadnoughts. We may need to come down here in earnest to really fight them if we want to.
Yeah, this is an era where PL is trying to find its place in the world as well. When you bring a super capital armada down, people clam up. So PL tries a strategy of deploying without super caps at all. And then they see everyone around them start using super caps against them. And so it's like this real sense of frustration.
So there is a decision to deploy super capitals down south, right, in the middle of 2018. This leads up to UALX battle. What was the lead up to UALX?
Just a lot of that frustration that you were talking about, where obviously Tappy goes and pulls out the rug from PL, and then PL and a few allies down there say, hey, you know what, this area of space is ripe for the taking. These test guys are getting a little bit big. I think we can fight them again. I think we can do it. And then as they try, they realize that not only has Test gotten quite big, but they are a force to be reckoned with. Not only do they stand toe-to-toe with some of the bigger alliances out there, they've got a super cap fleet now, so you can't really out-blob them but at all, and they're all shield supers as well. So,
right, the most people,
another piece,
weaponry,
especially involving Test in 2018, I don't think we covered it, was the outpost changeover. Towards the beginning half of 2018, all outposts in Nullsec were transferred over into faction Fortizars, and the owner of that structure, or the outpost when it happened, was the owner of the Fortizar. And as it turns out, I believe it was, Test came through Providence at the last minute, when Providence had a ton of these outposts built in it over the years, and just managed to grab a ton, just an unbelievable amount of these faction Fortizars, which set them up for success for the rest of the year.
Right.
Very well said.
Very well reviewed. we said that already, but okay.
Damn it.
But that's good. It's good. So the last part of this is that 2018 is a huge year for EVE Online, because you have two things going on at the same time. You have the Imperium ravaging the north, or there's big fighting going on, and you have huge battles like 9-Tac R, X-47, and the Sino Jammer is a real hero in that it helps slow down that momentum, but the Imperium, in order to stay active, goes into low sec and wipes out some keep stars in low sec. I managed, because I owned 2 of them. One was in Mela, one was in Onanen, with Pfeiffer, and I managed to pull down the Onanen keep star and sell it to Test, who put it up as the perimeter keep star. And unfortunately, Pfeiffer used Horde to try to extract, but he was picked off and his got stolen. So I paid him a certain amount of money just so he didn't feel really bad about it. And that was what happened to those 2 keep stars. They were part of a trade network that, again, Lenny Kravitz, remember from Brave and also from World War B, he started to fund this thing that was going to be a trade network, but it never got off the ground, and politically it was never seen as neutral. So that's where those remnants of those keep stars went. And so that's what's going on in the north. You have tribute, you have Guardians of the Galaxy just getting pummeled by the Imperium. In the south, you have PL now down there in Ernst, with Winter Coalition fighting Legacy, and you jump into this, we have this huge fight known as UALX, which I think is probably the second most important fight of the last 10 years. And the reason that's important, well, actually, Elise, would you have any thoughts on UALX?
No, I'd like to hear what you think about it. So let's hear.
Well, what happens at UALX is that Test, or Legacy Coalition led by Test, fears that they're about to be destroyed because now PL is in the area with super capitals, and this is always a bad thing, right? This Pandemic Legion, they're a historic group that are really good at using these things. Although the world has changed, they're still to be reckoned with. And UALX, there's a keep star that's put down by Test, and it is destroyed by Winter Coalition, Pandemic Legion, and now assisted by Elo Knight and Black Legion. And you have, I think, Triumvirate was there. There's Triumvirate was there too. So you have a lot of groups fighting Test, and this is really the big showdown. And so that staging for keep star is destroyed, but in the process, because of tie-dye and because the server crashes, you have PL's super capital fleet get pinned down, and they have to log off because there's just too much. I think because the time runs out on them, basically. And so in doing that, it was, first of all, a huge fight, but also you have PL stuck. And that becomes, I think, a huge pivot point for a perception of power. Legacy now looks as strong as Pandemic Legion and Winter Coalition.
Yeah, a few things happen. So like PL and the group that PL are working with end up having like a pretty good showing, right? There's like almost 4,000 people. The objective seems to be happening. NC Dot is slowly moving down from the north because they're not staged with their super capitals down south. So NC Dot starts slowly going down, and halfway through, just a little bit more than halfway through, they stop coming down. They're like, oh, well, you guys got it handled. Test Alliance also start working with friends in Goon Swarm and the Imperium. And so those guys start moving over. So although the Keep Star dies, Pandemic Legion and everyone else around them, like BL, Fraternity, the Winter Coalition, they start getting overwhelmed by just these waves of legacy people that just keep coming in. They don't retreat. They don't see this as a failure. They see this as a point to show how far they've come. And I think a lot of it has to do with, and for whatever reason, I always come back to this, but Vili being into Test Alliance has given them a sense of military legitimacy, where they are not only someone that can be a good ally, they can stand alone and fight against the best of the best and against the biggest waves, and they don't back down. So, and I think this really starts to embolden Legacy. And it's probably been emboldened before, but I think this is like where any doubter against Legacy just gets turned away right now.
Yeah. And of course, they're helped by Goonswarm in that fight nearly at the end, which also shows you the Imperial Legacy Super Coalition, two of the biggest groups working together for mutual safety. And it really kind of resets the balance of power in a big way. UALX is important for a number of reasons. You have, I think Elo Knight does some amazing things to help people extract from there a few days later. PL does eventually get out. They were not, because they were stuck there, it looked like they might be crushed. Just like has happened historically to a number of groups when they get their stuff stuck. Like even Bob was stuck in a station. They couldn't get their stuff out. So
PL's been their Super Cat fleet stuck more times than anyone else, I think.
Really?
We make some questionable decisions.
Well, it's a risk each time. So that was 2018. Up north, you have huge fights again that's happening. 9-TAC, that was the biggest fight in EVE's history was 9-TAC 4, and that was about 6,400 people. I broadcast for 8 hours straight, and we had 12,000 people watching EVE Online. It was the $1 Million War, as ProGod pre-primed the publicity machine for that one. And you also had X47, which was a huge trade-off of Titans. The game was suffering a lot of problems on the server level where disconnects really made the game unfun and feel unfair. So I think after those fights, you saw everything kind of calm down and lead into 2019 rather calmly. But there's a big change that happens, and we can end on this because we covered 2019 recently on 3 episodes. But at a certain point, the DRF collapses completely. Skill U inherits a bunch of land, and they decide they're going to leave the game, so they collapse completely, handing over a lot of territory to Horde and to Winter Coalition. Winter is in the middle of a war with Legacy. And about the middle of 2019, the Imperium decides they're going to strike again after... I think after this is funny, but basically CCP bans a bunch of bots, and they say these bots came from 2 places. They came from sorry. Thanks for hanging out with us, Elise. I know you have to take off. We'll wrap it up right now in like 2 minutes. But I want to say that the up north... Oh, Elise, you still there?
Yeah, just for a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay, good. All right. So let me just ask you if you have anything to say about this next era, which is the glassing of Tribute, and then the Drifters, and then Blackout.
After X47, I think there's like a pretty big culture change in the North. Instead of being just a bunch of groups that are kind of glued together, they try to really formalize a coalition up there and kind of cement some friendships and things like that, which when we're going into 2019, the Imperium just absolutely punished going into that. But there is definitely that move to try and become a little bit more organized and try to copy, in a sense, the Imperium playbook.
Yeah. So that's when it changes, right? Because I never knew when it changes. Remember, the last 3 years, there's lots of discussions about how to win EVE Online because Delve is doing pretty well, and now Legacy's copying their style. The North is not, or what's going on behind the scenes there? I know some people are saying we got to do what they're doing. We got to build up an area where we build this machine, this industrial base where we can create, large ships.
Yeah, once the North sees what the Imperium has done while they've been sitting and goofing,
are you surprised? Then they decide it's time to do that.
They say, okay, this is definitely how it has to be. Okay. We have to do this in order to maintain relevant. Otherwise, we're going to be gone. I remember Gobbin's theory crafting, like, hey, what would happen if the Imperium just take shield supers and park them in the North while having armor supers parked in the south. They literally have the numbers to outblob us on both fronts without having to move. And I think that's the big impetus.
Right. The end of the arms race, basically. So who was the proponent of moving to drone lens then?
That was a Goblin special, Fortress drones. I mean, the way the drone lands are laid out, it's perfect for trying to copy the Imperium. There are so many systems that can be reached in just one area.
So it's good for this model of gameplay, the empire building where you protect with one police force in the middle. Okay, so that's what happens after. Okay, so by the way, even Mittani was surprised by how many Titans came up to the north to Glass Tribute. And I'll explain how that began. There was CCP who put out this blog post where they deleted bots, and they said they're from Winter Coalition, but also from the Imperium's Winter Coalition. And people laughed, and Elo Knight says, hey, why don't you put out the numbers that tell us where how many people from each place was banned, because we've always accused Imperium of having a lot of botters and RMTers. So CCP doesn't publish how many were banned for that one episode. They publish who's been banned from the game going back to like 2005 or something, some ridiculously long number. And on there is not the Imperium. And so the Imperium laughs and says, see, we told you we're not botters and RMTers, and we're going to go up there and punish you now for saying that we were. And so that's why they go up to Tribute, and they basically destroy the whole place. But they were expecting the same numbers or a little bit more than they had in the summer of 2018, right? This is a year later, and they have actually doubled their numbers, and now they have over 1,000 Titans. And this is not counting mothership, super carriers or at all. So 1,000 Titans, they thought they could get maybe 600, maybe 700, and they end up getting nearly 1,000 or over 1,000. And that just surprises and shocks everybody that the industrial base is that strong. And that's when you see the North say, it's time to do what they're doing. Let's do it in this area where it's really good land for doing that. And that's what's been happening since. Okay. That brings us into 2019, which is just this last summer. And we talked about it over 3 episodes. We won't go into this, but I just want to, in quick succession, say you have some big things that happen here. Right after Tribute is pretty much over, CCP unleashes the Drifters. The Drifters are followed by Blackout. Blackout's followed by a lot of angst among all players, and not just Imperium that's affected by it tremendously, but also Northern players and DRF are affected. And Winter Coalition, essentially their defenses disintegrate because their ADMs fall. And you see Legacy win that war nearly at the end of the year. And Winter Coalition is broken and falls back. And that's kind of pretty much where we're at now. Right? Ashterothi, you have anything you want to fill in on 2019?
I would say that 2019 was kind of the rise of HiSec. You see a lot of focus on making high security space exciting and interesting and engaging. During 2018, they did a lot of research. You have the sale to the other company,
Perlibis.
Perlibis, thank you.
You have the sale to Perlibis, which I believe is what made them review a bunch of stuff, and they discovered a lot of metrics that they hadn't really sorted out before. So you immediately see a war deck change at the end of 2018, followed up by 2 more war deck changes at the beginning of 2019. You see invasions, which brings new and revitalized raid content, first to HiSec and then to LowSec. And you see the introduction of the Rasnaborg, which adds a new and kind of interesting challenge for HiSecers and a reward for those who know how to use DScan. And you also see the rise of the emerging conduits, which basically add nullsec level ratting income to HiSec. So all these things combined, you see these larger high-sec organizations starting to be form. You see more people like myself who are voluntarily moving back to high-sec in order to engage with that sort of content.
Right. It's lucrative and it's interesting gameplay, and you can kind of do it on your own time. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to 2020, the beginning of the year. It was a few days ago. And going back and looking at 2015 and the decade in general, there was a lot of big pivotal moves. And so if you look at it, you had in these last 5 years a switch from nomadic groups being powerful to empire building, especially in Delve, generating enormous amount of super capital power because of changes to skills and to the ships that could mine. And that pretty much made them too big a powerhouse to contend with. And so you saw the North eventually, after 3 or 4 years of fumbling around, start to do the same thing, but they are very far behind in that process. In the meantime, you saw the company, CCP, focus on trying to stop that kind of overpoweredness by creating a blackout effect, which basically made it very difficult to rat and mine in large amounts. But that had a very oppressive and very oppressing effect to people who would do that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of discontent about it. So they lifted blackout. They always meant it as an experiment to see what people would do anyway, but they did lift it. And in the aftermath, they changed how sinos work. And so you're seeing more of a chiseling effect on slowing down the massive economy that is generated through very safe means in nullsec and has really propelled the game. In wormholes, you're seeing a massive eviction wave coming through from, is it Inner Hell? It's a Russian group. I think it's Quantum Explosion's, hereditary successor. And they are now just just destroying wormhole space for certain groups. And that appears to continue to be going on. But you also saw something that we skipped. You saw a wormhole group, the biggest ones, Hard Knocks. They lived in a system called Rage. And the beginning of 2018, I think it was, you saw the initiative invade that and destroy 2 keep stars, which were thought to be undestroyable. But initiative did it, which signaled that nullsec could at any time come into wormhole space and destroy them, that they could impose power on that group, that the wormholes were not a safety barrier for them, which was very, very shocking to that community. Again, you saw high-sec come up in prominence because there's a lot of neat activity there with the invasion expansion. And again, in nullsec, you see the trying to cut the amount of money that can be generated safely in nullsec. And finally, at the end of the year here, we have CCP surprising everybody by bringing gambling into the game again, or games of chance, through this thing called HyperNet, which was super hot when it first came out. First day was incredibly hot. Then during the month after that, it slowly kind of stabilized. And we don't know where it's going to land, but it's a new economic model that basically allows a person to sell lottery tickets to an item they want to sell. You can only sell one item at a time, and it allows multiple people to bid on it. So we'll see where that goes. So that's where we are here at 2020. And that was your last 5 years. And if you listen to the first episode, that's your last decade of EVE Online. You are somewhat caught up. Now, feel free to come to Talking in Stations and hang out with us and learn more about the last decade. A lot of veterans, if not all of them, are here in Discord for Talking in Stations. Ash, any last words on the last decade?
Yeah, I wanted to say that there's a piece to the last decade that we haven't really talked about at all, which I'm very connected to, which is the streaming community. We see this big rise of the streamers that came from World War B, covering it and talking about it. And then when the casinos came out or got banned. You see a collapse of a lot of those people as there wasn't enough content and there wasn't a bankroll anymore. But then you see this emergence of Streamfleet and this coordination of effort between streamers. And now I got to say that we have some of the best group of streamers and best community on Twitch that I have seen in EVE so far. I just wanted to bring special note to a couple of things. First of all, Streamfleet recently did a big charity for Take This, where we raised a ton of money, and it was a great time. It was I think 48 hours of straight streaming. I was proud to be part of it, and a lot of people got shaved. I also want to point out three streamers that are not necessarily as big, but probably deserve your attention. Melody April, who is actually in chat right now. She streams a lot. She did 17 hours on New Year's, I think it was, trying to make money to be able to give it away to the stream. And she has a little voice to text thing in all of her chat. So she gives everybody different voices so you can actually hear everybody talk to each other. It's kind of cool. You have Miranda Lorian, who is a streamer for the U.S. Army stream team. So she's an official streamer for the U.S. Army, which is super cool in my opinion. And she does EVE, so she's bringing EVE to that, and she's bringing the U.S. Army to us. And then you also have Hateless Gaming, who is a good friend of mine. And if you ever want to know how to make tons and tons of ISK and lose tons and tons of ISK in high sec, please watch Hateless Gaming.
Yeah,
that's it. That's what I got.
He's in our group at TIS here too. That's a good point. One other thing that we didn't cover is what CCP was doing with the community. There's been a big change there. Last year, they went on tour to many cities, and they really changed their philosophy on the community, I think, when they met Russian players and especially Australian players. And one of the key Australian players, known as Bram Stroker, was actually hired by CCP. And you can see him in here in chat. He is CCP convict now, and we love him. They also have on that team, they're all great. You have Dopamine, who's fantastic, and I think Spider joined that team as well. Those guys are all great. They're just so engaged. Unfortunately, we saw the departure of CCP Guard, a staple of EVE Online, and Falcon as well, an old-time player, a historic player, and Falcon has left the company as well. But we're looking forward to more EVE community with Convict and Dopamine and Spider. Okay, so I think we did a pretty good job here at TIS to review the last decade, which we didn't expect to do. This was a last-minute decision. It was all done by memory. There are no show notes. That's why we're kind of fumbling around. We had the pleasure of having Dirk McGurk and Elise Randolph, Ashterothi, and Maccloud, and myself all go through the last 10 years and try to hit some of the highlights and some of the reasons that things are the way they are right now, today. And so everything is connected. It's a giant continuum, both nullsec, highsec, wormhole space, all industry, everything is connected in EVE Online. That's why it's such a great big world with a lot of geography. That's why it's so interesting, and also why it's so difficult. If you would like to help out Talking in Stations, please join our Discord and hang out with us. You can go to talkinginstations.com to look up back issues. We would very much appreciate donations through Patreon. And again, but more than that, we appreciate you just being active and hanging out and either teaching other people how to play this game or learning from it. And there's my annoying spam call. It's just in time for the ending. All right. Thanks, Ashterothi. Thanks, Maccloud.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, everybody, for listening to Talking in Stations today. We will see you next time on Talking in Stations.